Thank you for tuning into this question and answer video to ask two of the Green Party leadership candidates a few questions about topics that the Greenhouse think tank has been researching over the past few years that are close to our hearts. This video complements a series of posts on the Greenhouse think tank website with Q&A from the leadership and deputy leadership candidates, and you can see the show notes for the link. We'll be covering several issues which we hope might be of interest to British audiences, especially Green Party members taking part in the postal vote over August. I'm very pleased to welcome Deputy Leader of the Green Party and London Assembly Member Zach Polanski and Joint Party Leader and MP for Waveney Valley Adrian Ramsey, who has paired up with MP Ellie Chowns as joint candidates. Thank you, gentlemen, for participating. I know you've been debating with one another over several times since the nominations were announced, and you've a busy schedule ahead of you over the next few weeks, so I'm really grateful you've made the time. And I'll turn to you, Zach, for the first question. The Bank of England could expand money supply in coordination with His Majesty's Treasury to generate funds for investing in greening our infrastructure. Do you support such ideas? If not, how else should we fund the green transformation of the economy?
Anything we can do, we can afford, and ultimately we should look at fiscal expansion. The only limit should be inflation and our resources. But with the Green Party, we know that we have ecological boundaries, and that largely is our resources. So, of course, we shouldn't be pushing at sustainable boundaries and we shouldn't be pushing at ecological boundaries. What we should be doing, though, is investing in capital infrastructure, particularly against the climate emergency, to make sure we're investing in future jobs, in future capital infrastructure in terms of the ways we get about, the ways we heat our homes. All of these things are waiting to happen and need to happen anyway. We know that during COVID, the government did make changes and they responded to a crisis. We are in a climate crisis right now. And during COVID, we were lending money to banks and we are now still paying interest on that money to corporate capital. That makes completely no sense. And that is all the result of political choices. We should make different political choices.
So, broadly, Zach, would you be in favour of expanding the supply of money, or would you be trying to sort of increase taxes to remain within the kind of fiscal envelopes?
I don't think it's an either or, but I think we always need to be clear that we are not taxing people to raise money. We have a sovereign currency and we know that we can do that. Having said that, we do have mass inequality in our society, and taxation is a really effective way of reducing that inequality. And I think there's a moral principle here too, that those who work with their hands or with their brains are often paying more tax in their earned income than someone who is a multimillionaire or billionaire who is sleeping, who is paying less tax on unearned wealth. So those are things we need to fix anyway, but we're not fixing them necessarily to invest in our public services. We can and we should do that anyway.
And do you think that the wealth taxes that are being proposed are going to be adequate? I mean, at the moment, the Green Party is advocating sort of a threshold of about 10 million assets.
Yeah, so we're advocating for 1% on £10 million or more, or 2% on £1 billion or more. I guess the question adequate is relative. I think it's adequate in terms of really kickstarting that conversation, in terms of the really important narrative that people who have immense amounts of wealth will not just leave because actually it's an assets. And when they're hoarding those assets, that's bad for our economy anyway, because that's money that could be flowing around it. Is it adequate? No, it's not. There's lots of other things we need to be doing. But considering how much of a narrative struggle is going on at the moment to win this first argument that the super wealthy should pay a little bit more in tax, I think let's focus on that. And then the next steps, I think, are clear where we need to go, but I think one step at a time.
So, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're suggesting we start off with the super wealthy, but then head down the wealth Gini coefficient as people get more used to the idea.
Yeah, I also think there's an argument that needs to be made in this country that lots of us, and I say lots of us, not meaning the poorest people in society, but sort of middle earning incomes, probably do need to pay a little bit more in tax as well as, and that is also a healthy thing, um, as in most of Western Europe. But right now, when we have such deep inequality, since COVID, billionaire wealth has doubled while our public assets have been absolutely stripped away. So I'm definitely not advocating right now for more taxation, even on middle income earners. But I do think generally there is a job to do to have a more positive conversation in this story around taxation, and the even more urgent conversation to separate the idea that our national debt, as it's called, is a bad thing, because ultimately that national debt is often money that is going straight into our public services. And having a budget surplus actually means austerity, or we have prevented putting money into our public services. Those are complicated, nuanced things to communicate, but I'm absolutely convinced the Green Party have a major role in doing that in the future.
Well, question for you now, Adrian.
Well, hello, Prashant, and thank you very much to you and Greenhouse Think Tank for organising this discussion and for all the work that you do to generate evidence, ideas, thinking, and discussion in the Green Party and the wider Green movement. It's such an important part of our movement and of our party. This is a really important question because at the general election last year, we put forward a bold manifesto and a credible manifesto for how we could bring about a different future, a greener future where we have the transition to a green economy across every aspect of what we do to tackle the climate crisis, tackle environmental pollution, create the jobs that we need, create a more equal society. And we also showed how we want to invest properly in our public services and in tackling inequality as well. And clearly, our ambitions for investment were well ahead of where any of the other parties are. And I was tested forensically during that general election on exactly how we would make those things happen. So, very happy to revisit that with you now. I mean, we've got to put in substantial investment into moving to a green economy. And I completely agree with the Climate Change Committee's conclusions, which highlight that actually not only is this crucial for seeking to avoid the worst effects of climate breakdown and insulate Britain as far as we possibly can from the effects of the changing climate, which are already happening around us. But actually, as well as making environmental sense, it also makes economic sense. It will cost far more if we don't invest than if we do because of the problems we'll have to clean up. And so, whilst the sums are significant, we've got to recognise the paybacks there will be environmentally, economically, in terms of the good quality jobs we can create in green industries where people are then able to pay back into society through their income tax. And so I want to see that investment happen. And a lot of that investment is about capital infrastructure, isn't it? It's about the new train routes, it's about the new renewable energy systems that we want to see, about insulating people's homes. It's about the infrastructure we need to support our farmers to produce more food in the UK. And when we're looking at capital investment, there's a number of ways we can do that. I mean, the conventional route is through government borrowing, which is an efficient way to do borrowing to invest in the things you need for society. But direct money creation is also another way of doing it, is another perfectly valid option, as long as you do it in a responsible way. And the Green Party's policies, which do envisage having a national monetary authority that oversees how we would do money creation, both in terms of democratic responsibility, but also making sure you've got the right expertise from economists um, feeding into that, because if you produce too much money in that way, it can lead to inflation, which is not what we want to see, that we know the impact that has on people. But at the same time, there are ways of creating money or borrowing to put that investment that's needed into creating a green economy for the future. And it's absolutely essential that we do that. It goes back to the ideas of the Green New Deal from 2008 and before and since, where green economists have argued very strongly we've got to put that investment in that will enable us to get to a better form of society where it is cheaper for people to get around. We've got cleaner air, we've got good jobs in clean, renewable industries, and we're producing more of our food locally and being
Thank
more
you.
sustainable in that way.
If I may just push on that, I mean, you mentioned a green monetary authority. We already have a
Yes.
monetary authority, the Bank of England. Are you talking about anything other than that, or are you talking about the Bank of England?
I'm talking about the idea of a national monetary authority, which is in the Green Party's policies for a sustainable society. And the idea of that is that you've got a body that has oversight of how you do spending. So if you are creating money to invest in capital infrastructure, investment in a green economy, then you're doing that in a responsible way. And it has to have some democratic oversight, absolutely, but also input from economists to make sure the wider impacts on the economy are as we'd want there to be, because we are working within an international economic framework. That's the reality. But actually, I think that the markets would understand and respond positively to the right sorts of investment. That's what Greens absolutely want to see. And that's what we're arguing and putting forward. And actually, if you think back to how Gordon Brown dealt with the international crash in 2008, the idea of quantitative easing, of pumping loads of money into the economy, was something that was sort of put forward then as the savior of the economy, but actually he was just pumping money into the economy in a totally values-free way. We could at that time have been putting money into the economy in a way that was investing in the green industries of the future. That was why the Green New Deal was born as an idea at that time. And so that's the sort of thing I want to see, is making sure that if we're putting money into the economy, we're doing that in a way that's creating the transition we so desperately need.
Thank you very much, Adrian. The second question now. We know that the Green Party wants to significantly increase its representation in Parliament from the present 4 MPs and 2 baronesses, but this wouldn't necessarily change the UK's political landscape very much. What would success for England and Wales's Green Party look like to you? And please don't feel obliged to answer in terms of electoral success. It can be more than that.
Well, I'll give an electoral part to the answer and a non-electoral part. I mean, on an electoral part, imagine if after the next general election, rather than having a horrific reform-led government, Labour are a bit short of a majority, and we've got enough Green MPs there to have a big impact on the future direction of our country and all the things that we want to influence as Greens, on climate, on inequality, on restoring public services. We could achieve that if we build on the transformational, record-breaking success we've had of recent years and scale up what we learnt and delivered successfully in 2024 to have far more target seats next time and get far more Greens elected. If we continue to have leaders with that track record of winning under first past the post, as Ellie and I do, and of speaking to a wide audience, taking that Green message to a wide audience that's needed to win under the voting system we have, then we can absolutely make that happen. So in electoral terms, that would be my aim, as well as making sure we make the breakthrough into the Senate next year and continue to win many, many more councillors, as we are doing with that fantastic trajectory of recent years. But it is also about the impact we have when we get elected at all levels of government. And to take what Ellie and I and Carla and Sean are doing in Westminster as an example, there are plenty of examples of where we've come together with progressive MPs of other parties to press for things that have changed the government's direction. For example, when it was bringing in the horrific cuts to PIP that were going to affect some of the most ill and disabled people in society, the government backtracked from a large part of what it was proposing because of the cross-party strong strength of campaign, reflecting what the country felt on that issue and reflecting disabled people's voices on that crucial topic. If we continue to push Labour on these things, I really hope we can influence the agenda more broadly. So, for example, the Green Party's long calls to tax wealth fairly are now getting wider support from other MPs, from Labour backbenchers, from people across Parliament. We need to keep that campaign going. Just as our calls for recognising the state of Palestine, we had 270 MPs sign a letter on that last week. Now suddenly the government's thinking about it. And Greens have been part of that. Ellie's been calling for recognising the genocide in Gaza and standing up for an ethical foreign policy every week in Parliament. So whether it's on calling out the backsliding on climate and nature, whether it's on an ethical foreign policy, whether it's on protecting the most vulnerable, what we're doing in Parliament is seeking to shift the agenda and the debate. We can already show we're doing that. And if we continue to have Green leaders at the heart of British political debate in Westminster, we can continue to shift that debate.
Thank you very much. Zach, can I just ask you the same question, the second question?
Success looks like when we're no longer the most nature depleted or one of the most nature depleted countries in the world, when we're actually mitigating our emissions and we're taking climate adaptation seriously. Success looks like major investment into the public sector, particularly around things like installing heat pumps and insulating our homes so they're warmer in the winter and cooler in the summer. That's both important to do for the climate crisis. It's important in terms of lowering people's bills, but it's really important too in creating great green jobs that can be in the public sector, that can be paid properly, where people at work can be treated with dignity and care and proper working conditions and have the right to organise and strike if necessary. So what does success look like? It looks like transforming our society. It looks like making sure that we're making the case for beautiful green spaces that people can enjoy more time with friends, family and loved ones, where we're not working more hours for less pay, but actually we have a 4-day working week and potentially universal basic income and or universal basic services. There's a debate to be had there, but fundamentally the important thing for me is that people are not living in precarious lives and actually people have the safety and security they do. And also, just to finish off this answer, as a previous theatre actor, it's about art and culture too, where people aren't just kind of on a rat run or just trying to get by, but actually everyone, and not just wealthy people, have access to what diverse cultures feel like and look like, to the art of storytelling, and crucially knowing that they are the protagonist in every story.
I mean, obviously, there's a political aspect to this question as well. And the Green Party of England and Wales, I think all parties would echo some of the things that you've said. But how would a party actually, which is in a minority government at best, how will it actually, what will it be doing? What will it have been seeking to achieve?
So if we are talking in electoral politics, that's, I think, even easier. We cannot have slow and steady incremental change. And I was so proud that we've won 4 MPs. I worked really hard, as so many thousands of members did, while I've been deputy leader, to go all around the country, campaign, door knock, leaflet, target to win. That's not going to change under my leadership. I want to continue to doing that. The real challenge here, though, is if we don't break through on national media and if we aren't telling more powerful stories, the amount of MPs we can get is quite capped because actually the amount of money, the amount of resource time it took to get those MPs elected, right now, every single MP we have is either been a party leader or is running to be a party leader. That's not a replicable strategy. There is so much skills acquisition we need to do in this party, and that involves having a leadership team that is outside of Parliament so the parliamentarians can focus on scrutiny and on legislation and doing the brilliant work they are. And the 3 people who are outside of Parliament, i.e., me and 2 deputy leaders, can do the movement building, can work with trade unions, can work with campaign organisations, can work with grassroots Greens organisations to build a mass movement. And that's exactly how we look at more like 40 MPs next time. But also, the very last thing I'd say is this isn't some abstract idea. When we look at the Lib Dems, they have 72 MPs. Great, I'd love 72 MPs. But they don't have a coherent narrative. I don't know what they want to do to transform society or what they really stand for. And I never want us to replicate a Lib Dem strategy of having a big bunch of MPs, but not knowing what we stand for. It's really clear what the Green Party mission is. So yes, we need more MPs, and that's why I advocate for Target to win. But I advocate scaling it up through a mass movement that is through the media and social media, where we cut through with clear communication, with exciting messages, and inspiring people so we can build the next generation of Green MPs.
Thank you very much. Next question. Many people have written about the deficiencies in GDP in measuring well-being and criticized society's obsession with its growth. How would you address the inevitable mainstream response that we'll be unable to fund public services without some kind of economic growth?
I think there's no other way to do it but then go to toe and be brave and tell the truth. And the truth is that trickle-down economics has completely failed this country. The truth is that Liz Truss was not an aberration. She is a natural extension of both Tory neoliberal ideology, but frankly, exactly what the Labour government are doing now. They're doing it slightly different, and there's more nuance to it. But if essentially they're talking about taking off the reins, deregulation, making sure that they're not actually investing in the public sector, but they are, it's almost even worse when you think about GB trains, that they talk about, the railways, that they talk about nationalising our railways, but then the rolling stock, the actual train itself, is the thing that isn't nationalised. That then, at least you could argue the Tories are honest about the fact that they're taking our public money and investing in the free market or the private market. But Labour are doing it under lots of bureaucracy and lots of trickiness. And I think one of the places this is most stark to me, actually, is when we're spending £15 billion on nuclear weapons. And when initially it was 2.5% of GDP that was absolutely vital to ensure our security, then it was 3%, and now it's 5%. The way these numbers get bandied about, I think, exposes the complete deficiency in the GDP model. Because essentially the argument is if a country gets more prosperous, in some ways we're more at threat, so we need a bigger military. Or if somehow we were in a recession, that should be the time to reduce our military, when you could argue that's a time when you're much more likely to get civil unrest, fascism on our streets, etc. So this relationship between the defence spending that we do and the GDP is both nonsense in itself, but also the biggest problem with GDP is if I go for a run because I want to get healthy, that's great for me and it's also great for the National Health Service, but it doesn't register in any kind of financial measure. But if I buy a plastic water bottle or I go to a gym and spend membership, but while I'm there, I eat a burger and don't actually work out, that's great for GDP and apparently great for people's health. But clearly, that's a complete nonsense. So where I'm getting to is we need to measure things accurately, and that cannot be GDP because the very person who co-designed the concept says it's a terrible way to measure health and well-being. So why are we not looking at our mental health crisis and talking about what the more positive communities look like, and of course, individual well-being? What does it look like when we deal with the gender pay gap, the disability pay gap, the ethnicity pay gap? I think we actually need to look at the measures and criteria that actually matter. I think different ones will matter at different times, but the idea that GDP is the one, I think often it's the least one that we should be paying attention to, yet it's dominated the narrative for so long.
So if I may paraphrase you for a moment, so I think what you're saying is that on the GDP as an efficient measurement of success, we need to have a broader basket of indicators, and GDP may be one, maybe not. But on the issue of how we actually finance and how big the cake is that we're trying to reallocate, you're talking about reallocation rather than a focus too much on the trickle down kind of concept of grow, and then it'll be passed down to the needy.
Well, there isn't a limitation to the cake other than our ecological boundary, and for that, I think donut economics has a lot to be taken from. But if we take from that question that we're not hitting ecological boundaries, although of course in many areas that we are, but if the limit is not the ecological boundaries, then we know we've already talked about that in fiscal terms there isn't a boundary if we're investing. There's a big difference between borrowing money or quantitative easing or money creation to fund unfunded tax cuts. That is a must never do. But all of those measures to make sure that we're investing in this country is absolutely what we should be doing, because we know there are spending multipliers. There's been amazing work from Matthew and Elliot Johnson and Howard Reed here, which talks about, and indeed the Greenhouse think tank, I know lots of organizations have been on this, that every pound we spend into the economy, when we're actually spending it on something that is going to be to tackle the climate emergency or to improve our communities, that is an investment. So it's not just a spend where it's going into some kind of sinkhole. What it's actually doing is creating money for the future. We know the biggest thing to hold us back in terms of a society is austerity. Not only is it holding us back economically, I'm more worried about the fact that it's holding us back in terms of the lack of change in people's material living conditions is exactly what empowers someone like Reform or Nigel Farage to turn to working class communities who need their material living conditions changed, but not change those conditions, but point and scapegoat at migrants, at trans people, at disabled populations. And that is literally giving rise to fascism. So it's a really important question here in terms of what we do with this cake. And I want it to be heard very clearly that there is limitation to the cake, but the limitation is our natural ecological boundaries. The limitation is not the fiscal rules that are entirely made up to please markets. And the most deep irony here is that the markets have rejected Rachel Reeves anyway.
Thank you very much.
This is such an important issue, and I used to be a lecturer in environmental politics and economics, and I spoke to students a lot about what are different measures of economic success, how can we get beyond this really blunt instrument of GDP that measures all economic activity equally and doesn't account for the fact that we've got air pollution, which is causing deaths and illnesses around the country, that we've got we're not living within the natural means of the planet, we've got runaway climate change, we've got one of the most nature depleted countries on earth, and we've got an unequal society as well, where we're not meeting people's basic needs, whether that's in terms of income for the poorest or whether it's in terms of the NHS that we all rely on. So we need to have a different way of measuring economic success that's about the health of the planet, the health of society, whether we're meeting people's basic needs. That's the sort of economy that I want to see. And also, if we take that approach, if we recognize that, for example, if we bring in a redistributive tax policy where we are asking the richest to pay their fair share in tax, then the fact that the way you look at the level of economic activity happening changes completely, because you're actually redistributing a lot of that wealth to where it's needed and allowing government to invest in the public services that we need and invest properly in the green transition that will create a healthier future. But Greens look at these issues completely differently. If we have a society that's much healthier, that's more equal, we will prevent a lot of illnesses in the long term. We can have a big focus on health prevention. Obviously, that the people will still need the NHS for lots of things, but we could, over the long term, we could create a healthier society where we are reducing the demand on public services. But for the foreseeable future, we've got to put the investment in that's needed. And we absolutely always have to make sure that everyone has access to the services they need.
Thank you. I mean, one of your points is really that rather than the focus being on economic growth, we introduce a wealth tax, so there's a reallocation of existing economic activity. But again, the kind of charges that such a wealth tax might cause people of wealth to leave the country. So how do you sort of counter this if we don't want to grow, but we want to tax the existing wealthy people, but that's the most mobile people? What do we do about that conundrum?
Well, we put forward a proposal for a wealth tax in our general election manifesto. We've been working with the patriotic millionaires on that, and we've also been working with various academics on that who've modelled up how a wealth tax could be implemented and have actually made an assumption and accounted for some people leaving the country as a result. Now, I don't think that would be many people, because actually, if you look at the reasons why people are in the UK, it's the same as you and I. They have family roots here, they love being in our country. It's not as simple as that for people to just up sticks and go. And yes, a wealth tax should, account for there being some attrition, but I'm not expecting that to be significant. And we're actually seeing growing calls for wealth taxes in a number of countries. So we can look and see, well, what's going to happen in France and elsewhere where wealth taxes are being introduced, and how is that best managed?
Apart from climate change, there's little discussion of the threats from novel chemicals, eutrophication of water, and loss of biodiversity. How do you think we can raise voters' awareness and start meaningful policy change about these threats within the UK? And how else can we engage internationally on the boundaries that we're breaching?
I'm really glad you're asking this, because we've got to recognise that climate breakdown is a massive threat. It's right happening in front of us now. We've got to adapt to the changes in the climate that are already happening. That's not easy, but needs far, far more government focus. And yet, there are also many, many other environmental challenges that don't get the same level of focus. And that includes the fact that we are one of the most nature depleted countries on Earth. And as you say, our rivers are deeply polluted. It's a sign of human behaviour having a huge impact on our natural environment, and then affecting people as well. People who want to be able to enjoy the rivers. We all need good quality water. It affects tourism businesses, it affects wildlife. These things have a huge impact on people up and down the country. And so I think the idea that people are behaving in a way that's not respecting planetary boundaries is one that most people can identify with, because the river pollution and pollution of our seas is something that has caught people's imagination. So we do, as Greens, need to make sure that not only are we communicating our policies that we want to renationalise the water companies and ensure that the investment is going into fixing our crumbling infrastructure, not into shareholders' pockets. That's a popular policy that this government hasn't even been willing to consider. But at the same time, we need to get across this is an example of how we have had a degradation of our natural environment for a long period of time. And in a country where people, are known to love nature, love animals, we are seeing some of the most worrying signs of nature depletion. And I think people at an instinctive level do get that. But I think as Greens, we must not shy away from talking about these issues. And actually, the sorts of issues that Greens have been talking about for decades, the idea that there are limits to growth on a finite planet, that we are impacting the natural world. That's an idea, whose time has come in terms of the public being ready to hear these issues. So let's talk about the impact that it has on people's everyday lives. Let's talk about the impact it has on the economy, on pushing food prices up, for example, and how we need to see a relocalization of much of our economy. We want to be more resilient in our regions, in our country, with the things that we produce. And we want to support more regenerative agriculture, which is so crucial to tackling the problems of pollution that we face. And we want to support more farmers going in that direction. So practical policies that will make a difference, but yes, catching the eye, as this scandal of river pollution has done, about the degradation of the natural environment.
And I mean, some of this will obviously require international collaboration. And as we know, there's been a bit of a breakdown of a lot of the kind of international conventions and some of the kind of decision-making processes. How do we go about working with other countries now, especially with the sort of reluctance that the US is showing since elections?
Well, it's crucial that we do, and we have international collaboration wherever we can achieve that. And yes, the US has been deeply irresponsible, both on climate, but on other environmental policies and on its approach to trade. But we need to make sure that sustainability is built in at the heart of trade policies, of environmental agreements that we come up with other countries. And we've actually seen recent government trade agreements over the years since Brexit go in the wrong direction, go in the direction of agreeing more long distance trade of goods that then could undercut our own farmers if we're importing foods from Australia, for example, produced to lower environmental or animal welfare standards than will be produced in the UK. That's the opposite of what we need. It's why I want to have a particularly strong focus on trading with the EU, where standards tend to be higher and goods are coming from a shorter distance. But any trade deals need to have the environment built in at its absolute core. And we need to have far more of a focus as a UK, whether it's on our manufacturing, whether it's on our farming, on more resilience on more regional and UK production of the goods and services that we need. And we actually saw that in the steel debate, didn't we? Interestingly, the government decided that there was going to be a case for nationalising steel. Well, actually, let's look at what do we need steel for in the green industrial revolution. For example, more trains, more train routes, more wind turbines, and actually producing those things in the UK is going to be better especially if we're producing them with green steel, which we absolutely must get. That must be a crucial part of the transition. That's going to be better than long distance transportation.
That's just a quick follow-up question on that. I mean, a lot of the actual work on international pollution, biodiversity loss, it's not really a trade issue. It's mainly done through other conventions, Biodiversity Convention, the New Oceans Convention. How should we sort of reignite that kind of process, do you think?
But it's critical for the UK to be absolutely front and centre of that. And that starts with showing leadership ourselves, with making sure that our own plans for restoring nature, and it's not just about halting nature loss, it's actually about nature restoration, are actually on track. And, compared to the amount of attention that the crucial net zero goals get, the fact that the UK government already has a target of restoring 30% of land and sea for nature by 2030 gets very little attention. So we need to be showing leadership by example and absolutely fully engaging in those international discussions on biodiversity treaties, on other international conservation treaties, to make sure that the world as a whole is working on nature restoration in a way that is actually going to provide a livable planet long term and addresses the huge risks that we face, whether they're risks to our food supply, our water supply, to clean air, as a result of degradation of the natural environment and species loss.
Thank you. Zach, can I just ask you the same question?
Yeah, I spend a lot of time and have for the last few years traveling around the country giving talks and rallies. And one thing I very often talk about is this idea of intersectional justice, that the Green Party care about environmental justice, and that is absolutely interlinked with social, economic, racial, democratic, international justice, all of those justices. But what I've been doing recently is actually telling a story, a very specific story, because I think it demonstrates all of these in a much more tangible way. Now, I know the answer is going to be 2 minutes, so I'll give a very, very short potted version, but I would encourage people to go to truthaboutzane.com for more detail about what I'm about to tell. So in 2008, there was a flood in Chertsey, which is in Surrey, where a contaminated land site was flooded with floodwater, releasing hydrogen cyanide, which killed a young boy at 8 years old. It was in 2012, called Zane. His father, Kai, has been incredible ever since, going around the country. He's paralyzed and is in a wheelchair, talking about the risk of contaminated land. And as I've been telling this story, more and more people have come to me, particularly who live on council estates and very often working class people and or people of colour. And they've said, we've got this problem on our estate where something's been built on contaminated land nearby, and we are breathing in all the noxious fumes, our eyes are itchy, and when we complained to the private developer, they hired an air pollution unit that they hired. So they were not independent. This was a group of people hired by the private developers to tell everyone that everything is okay for their health and everything is going to be fine. And the reason why I'm telling this story is this is an environmental issue in terms of we have these contaminated land sites. We know the issue of forever chemicals is an absolute ticking time bomb. I chair the fire committee in London, and I've been talking about how the blood scandal, the post office scandal were things that people knew about, but never really came into national media until it blew. And I really believe that forever chemicals is going to be one of these stories, because actually the amount of times going around the country now, people have told me about their health. I met recently in Runcorn when I went there for the by-election, a dairy farmer who said he was having cows born with 3 legs. There was 2 babies that had been born blind in the area, and Monsanto for years ago were pumping contaminated land or dropping, sorry, toxic waste onto the land, which of course gives risks for food security and what's going on in our food. Very difficult to answer this in 2 minutes because you could talk for hours about this. But I guess my potted answer is this is, I think, a huge area of research that's going to become more and more interesting to people as we get more science about it and more research. And my job as a politician is to tell the stories with the science and research to make them interesting to grab people so they demand political change.
Thank you. There's a follow-on question there really about how we engage on these issues internationally, because a lot of them are actually sort of transboundary effects, biodiversity loss, climate change, obviously, but also some of the acid rains and some of the water pollution. Because the kind of slight breakdown now in some of the kind of international conventions and the kind of decision making, particularly with the US pulling out of some of these. I mean, how do we engage internationally on these kind of planetary boundaries, especially the new ones that haven't really been a topic of discussion yet?
The first thing to say is we absolutely have to. And when people say, "Oh, what difference will it make?" I think we do need to keep on to the idea of our country being, I was going to say a global leader, but maybe we could even drop the leader language. But being globally responsible, I think, would probably be more nuanced. We need to recognize through colonialism, empire, the Industrial Revolution, we have both a moral responsibility to accept the problems in the world have often been exacerbated by us, both in terms of a climate crisis, but even more obviously in terms of Afghanistan, in terms of Libya, in terms of foreign interventions that we have played major roles in. And I think there's a role here, particularly as the US seems to be going down this absolute spiral, to work even more closely with our European partners, knowing that Europe is at its heart meant to be a peace project, and also countries in the global south that have so often been left out of the conversation. It's interesting. I was on a panel recently with Assad Rehman from War on Want, and someone mentioned the Green New Deal. And he spoke very powerfully about how it's irritating to people from the global south when the Green New Deal is suggested as if that's some sort of new thing since 2008. And actually, there are plenty of countries in the global south that have long, for decades now, in fact, generations, been talking about the global inequality and the complete risks to their population. He also said powerfully, and I just want to put this in here, when global south communities look at Palestine, they both see their history in terms of colonization, they see the genocide that's happening right now in the present, but also they see the future. They see the future if there is not a huge change in how we do global politics. And I think the UK has a huge role to play there in taking responsibility for that. To answer your question more directly, though, we need those binding agreements. Global problems require global solutions, and it's never going to work in isolationism. We ultimately need to make sure we're at the table, that we're showing, again, global leadership, stroke, global responsibility, and making sure when we're at that table, we are engaging in those conversations with dignity, with respect, with humanity. And that the Prime Minister, or whoever it is there, is not always there in just a self-interested reason. And again, I come back to the power of storytelling. I was going to say he or she or they need to be able to come back to the country and speak to the country and bring them with them. So things feel like they're co-designed, because I think far too often people feel like things are done to them rather than with them. And again, I think that's one of the leading causes of fascism.
Thank you. Question 5. On which issues should the Green Party be a broad coalition that embraces diverse opinions? What specific issues do you feel a unified position is needed where we don't compromise on our core values?
I'm really pleased you're asking me this, because I read your two amazing blogs yesterday that were a response to the written questions that we answered. And one of them picked up on my phrase about that political parties should be broad churches, but even broad churches have walls. And they came back with the brilliant retort, I think it was Nadine, to say, should we be building walls when we should really be building bridges? And I disagree with that. I want to build bridges. I want to build bridges with lots of people and lots of communities, marginalized communities, communities of color, working class communities, people who are on the front line of the climate crisis, for people who have done the least to cause the climate crisis, who are often being hit the hardest. But I don't want to build bridges with people who are not fundamentally in an anti-racist movement. It's not good enough just not to be racist. You have to be actively anti-racist. It's not good enough to just not be not transphobic. You have to be actively anti-transphobic. You get the point with each of these measures. And so I want to build bridges with everybody who agrees with those values. And I think that's probably one of the broadest churches possible, because I think the arguments for liberation and for struggle are very easily made when they're told properly, because struggle recognizes struggle. And ultimately, anyone who is in a struggle, whether it's about their race, their gender, their disability, their income, their relationship to the world or to the climate crisis. I put, the 99% versus the 1% here. Shell, we are all in a struggle against fossil fuel barons who are destroying our planet, who knew exactly what they were doing and continued to do it. And so when I talk about the 99% versus the 1%, I sometimes get accused that that's polarizing language. Well, yes, it's polarizing and divisive, but it's divisive to the 1%. It's actually very unifying to literally every other person. And even then, it's not an attack on the 1%. It's saying to the 1%, many of whom do agree with this, that you should be paying more in tax, that you should be sharing your power and your wealth, that you should make sure that the rest of the 99% are at the table and you're not controlling the levers of the media, of the decisions that are made. You're not polluting our democracy, our environment, and our communities. I think all of that message is pretty unifying. So in terms of the broad coalition, I want the coalition to be as broad as it can possibly be, But you should never believe anyone who says that they want everyone to be in the coalition, because ultimately politics is about inequality and it's about struggle. It's about who gets and who loses. And ultimately, I want to make sure that the people who have the most to lose, or sorry, the people who are losing the most at the moment, stop losing. And actually, the people who have the most at the moment lose a little bit to share with the other people. But you can also make a very legitimate argument that they're not really losing. They live in a more equal society, and everyone benefits from a more equal society. I think that story is dying to be told.
I can imagine that there's quite a few people that might violently agree with you on many of the things you described, but then disagree on one or two. So, for instance, I can imagine the Conservative Party voters who totally agree with you on many of the things we talked about of planetary boundaries, chemicals, pollution, etc., but violently disagree with you on wealth redistribution at this kind of scale you hope for, I suppose. What would you say to those kind of people, and how would we kind of work with those kind of people?
I had a very odd moment yesterday where Michael Gove was on a podcast and described me as incredibly charismatic. And I thought, oh, is something happening here where, I don't know if Michael Gove would entirely agree with wealth redistribution, but I think there is something there about reaching out to people. Um, uh, I don't think Michael Gove's going to shift on this, but reaching out to people like the patriotic millionaires, I think they've done an amazing job in saying ultimately actually taxing us more is going to be better for the society. Now, there are people like the Patriotic Millionaires and lots of other groups that I think we can convince. I think to come to your question directly, there are some people that we won't convince because they utterly understand the argument. They utterly agree with the argument, but they are benefiting from that wealth. They are benefiting from that power. And that's exactly why a totally unifying message is never going to work, because it presumes that everyone is acting in good faith and that the inequality we have in our society is somehow an accident that has just happened as if nature intended it, as opposed to this has been the result of generations of consequences, particularly for people of color, suffered the worst consequences of this, where often through violent revolution or violent upheaval, whether it's through the feudal system, whether it's the peasants' revolt, very often people have come back and struggled. And I've been reading a book at the moment about Chile and Hollande in the 70s, and the fact that even then it looked like exciting things were happening and the establishment absolutely crushed him. We saw this with Yanis Varoufakis. We've seen it with Jeremy Corbyn. We know that when socialist powerful voices make the case, the establishment will always lash back. So I don't think we're going to win them over by appealing to them more. So in some ways, my answer about Michael Gove was completely the wrong answer. I don't think we win them over with charisma and subservience. I think we win them over actually by being really firm about what we stand for. And I think the powerful storytelling is for the rest of the population, so we can stand shoulder to shoulder and tell them this has got to change. And sorry, and finally the media is absolutely controlled by a few multimillionaires and billionaires. I think it's three or four people who own the majority of the media. Things are changing though now with social media. Obviously, that's problematic too in terms of its algorithms, but there are ways around it. I released a video last week about migration. It's had over 3 million views on lots of platforms. I think if we can find these ways to tell these powerful narratives that ultimately outline, yes, the policy, but even more importantly, on top of the policy, the emotive storytelling, that's how we change things. We cannot just do emotive storytelling. If it's not grounded in policy, then it's just nonsense and it'll fall down. But the policy itself is never enough.
Thank you. Well, a question for you now, Adrian.
Of course, we can't compromise on our core values. And let's look at what makes the Green Party what it is. What makes us who we are is we're the only party that recognises that we've got to work within the natural limits of the planet, that we've got to avoid runaway climate change, we've got to restore the natural environment, and we need to distribute natural resources in a way that enables everybody to meet their basic needs. Inequality is inherently linked to the degradation of the natural environment, because if you've got a very, very unequal society where the poorest people cannot meet their needs, then that is actually exacerbating environmental degradation as well. We've got to share more equally if we're going to stay within the natural means of the planet. And most importantly, we've got to share more equally if the poorest people around the world and in the UK are going to be able to have not only their basic needs met, but have a decent quality of life. And those basic principles of a more equal society, of a livable planet, of restoring the natural environment so that we've got a good quality of life, those things are core, absolutely core to what the Green Party stands for and to our roots. And I can't imagine anyone would want to be in the Green Party if they didn't stand for those things. Now, of course, as a party, we have a debate on what are the right policies towards achieving that. And so, for example, I think it's totally legitimate that on the discussions around energy, I support the Green Party's policies that we shouldn't have new nuclear power stations, because I think that that money would be far better spent on investing in renewable energy and on energy efficiency in terms of the timescales of that impact, and also in terms of us not having an answer to the nuclear waste problem. But I think it's completely legitimate for other people coming from the same set of values to argue that they think that new nuclear should be part of the mix if they want to make a counter argument to why they think that's better for solving the problems that we face. So if there are specific policy debates that we're going to have that are within those broad principles of what we come together to stand, I think we should it's not only about tolerating that, we should embrace that as a party. We should embrace the fact that there's going to be open discussion about, okay, well, how do we best achieve those big values, big scale goals that our party has? Our mission is too important to narrow down the scope of people in the party by saying you have to support every last letter of what's in our long policies. We've got great think tanks like Greenhouse doing work on, well, what does a post-growth society look like, for example, that really feed into these discussions. And, it's part of our democratic zeal of the party that's always been in our ethos to have open, respectful discussion on different issues. That must continue, with us all, of course, working for the same big goals that we stand for.
Thank you very much. Last question. It's about the good life.
Mm.
What one of the two things would you focus on to convince people that voting for a green future will provide their families with a good life?
Well, there are so many things I think about Green Party policies that would actually lead to a better quality of life. It's quality of life rather than growth at all costs is what the Green Party stands for. And there, are so many examples that we could quote in that. I mean, let's take housing, for example. The fact that we're willing to stand up to this government that wants to just put in place big targets for house building without clear targets for social and affordable housing, that's just going to be a developer's charter. So we want to make sure that everybody has good quality, affordable housing to live in, whether that's affordable to rent, often far more social rent we want to see, or affordable to buy. So the good life has to start with the basics, and that includes things like bringing down people's bills. We are the party that will invest in home insulation, that will have a more resilient economy where we're not seeing the price of energy and food skyrocket because of an international war. So we want to make sure that those things are on a sustainable footing. And then our policies on the natural environment, whether it's on air quality, clean air in our cities and our towns and our villages, whether it's on clean water, on addressing the sewage crisis, this will impact people's quality of life in their local communities in a very real way. So I think it's whether it's quality housing, whether it's people's bills, whether it's a natural environment, these are very tangible impacts for people that we need to get across is about what we mean when we say quality of life is what comes first.
Thank you very much. Just a quick follow-up question on that. I mean, your first point was about affordable housing and increasing the sort of proportion of affordable housing being built. What
Yes.
do you mean about that? Is that a numbers game, or is it a sort of a depth of discount? What is it you have in mind?
Well, we put forward a clear policy on social housing at the general election in terms of the numbers of social homes that we want to see built. It needs to be easier for councils to build council homes, easier for them to borrow money to do so. I know lots of Green councillors around the country that want to do more building of council homes, and that has to be the top focus because that's ensuring that when people need council housing and need to be able to need council housing to be able to have a decent quality home, that's there for them. What I think it's also about, though, is as well as having clear numbers for social homes, is clear numbers for homes that are more affordable for people to buy. So in my constituency, for example, and people say the same to me around the country, the homes that they're seeing being built are luxury affordable homes that are out of the reach of most local people, including young people who are trying to get their foot on the property ladder. I mean, that is out of the reach for a lot of people as it is, but even for those who are getting to that stage, we need to make sure the homes that are being built are actually meeting local need. And too often we see that not being the case. So we've got to be stricter with developers, both at government level and at council level, in the types of homes that are being built and ensuring the services that go with those homes are adequate as well, that there's new doctors and dentist places that the developers are required to invest in as part of these profitable developments.
Thank you very much.
The good life is so important. I think all of us on the left need to talk about it more often. We very often talk about those dystopian futures, and when you think about sci-fi, it's always about what the world's going to look like when we're at war, or at the climate crisis, or at the rise of fascism. And I think those are all legitimate things to be concerned about. We know from the doomsday clock, but more generally in the way that things are going on in the world, that we are marching towards those outcomes in lots of ways. But I think we need to imagine and hope what a better future looks like. And I think artists play a key role in this, in imagining through film, poetry, songs, theatre, whatever it might be. And crucially, I used to work in community theatre, where you encourage people, particularly marginalised communities, to tell their own stories. Augusto Boal calls it rehearsing the revolution. So it's a very interactive theatre where I used to play the oppressor, as they would describe it, and they would challenge me, and I would challenge them back. And what you're doing is encouraging people to find their own agency, their own power in how they challenge these narratives. I'd love to see more facilitated work going on in communities where we imagine what would good look like. We imagine what the better future would look like. We imagine what it looks like when we have worker control in our organizations, when people are able to have incentives and again, agency. It keeps coming back to agency in how they live their lives. When we know that in terms of the public spaces, this awful public-private partnerships, I won't go off on one here, but it's one of the my pet hates is these spaces, particularly in the cities, that very often look like they're public, but then you'll see a sneaky sign that says CCTV, no eating in this space, no skateboarding, no ball games. Now, all of these things can seem a bit innocuous, like why would you worry about them? But they're an absolute creep where our public space is being taken away and private capital is literally informing the very physical place that we have. At the same time that community centres have been absolutely demolished and decimated. Thatcher said there's no such thing as society, and that was kind of an abstract idea for her. But now, in the destruction of these physical spaces, I think that's what's coming true. I think what the good life looks like is re-looking at community. What does it look like when people can eat together, when people of different cultures can come round? Whether it's on the road, that should no longer be a road ideally, but actually should be space for people with disabilities to get around, for active travel, where we plant trees. Very often outside a school, if there's a road, if you put cones in front of the schools, what do the kids do? They immediately get out and play. Now that's the kid version of it, but the adult version, what does it look like if we have more space to play? What does it look like if we have more creativity? What does it look like when we feel more rooted to place? Less politics in terms of formal party politics and more kind of organizing within the community. And I think in Belgium, the Workers' Party have done amazing work around this, around organizing around libraries, community centres, food banks. What does it look like when people have the power?
Thank you very much, Adrian and Zach, for sharing your ideas with us, and best of luck with the remainder of your campaigns. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President. Thank you.
Right.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Take care, all. Nice to meet you all.
Yeah, thank you. To find out more about Greenhouse Think Tank or see more about the actual questions and answers from this debate and also the deputy leadership, look at our website. That's at greenhousethinktank.org. Thank you very much. Bye bye.